Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I do look like my voice. It's been a long afternoon. I've been here all afternoon taking notes, and we've heard a lot of things that have been talked about. I've been doing science reporting for 40 years now. In fact, my first science story was Earth Day 1 back in 1970. So I've discovered in all those years of doing science reporting that there are a couple of issues that never go away that are always here. One is that we're going to have nuclear fusion 30 years from now. Every year it's 30 years from now. And that every 15 years we're going to do something about the Gulf. I remember moderating a panel discussion of governors of the Gulf states. This has got to be 15 years ago. And I could swear those were the same slides I saw up there 15, 20 years ago that I saw today about, problems with the coastal land being lost and the barrier, rebuilding the barrier islands and yada, yada, yada. People just keep talking about this stuff, and every once in a while a hurricane or a natural disaster or something will come along and it bubbles up to the surface, and the coast and the Gulf bubbles down and loses more land or has another insult to its coastline. So it's a constant thing, and having spent 10 years as a reporter in Washington when watching the machinations, I know that you folks in the audience work somewhere in government. You wouldn't be here. Or you work for some sort of lobbying organization or some sort of marine coastal environmental people, because I've seen a lot of you and I've interfaced with audiences like this before. I want to know from you, and I'll ask the panel of this question, everything that you've heard today, do you believe any of this thing can happen? I mean, we've talked about money being set aside. Will that money be spent? We've talked about great ideas, and we've had presidential commissions before. I've seen a dozen of them that get put up on a shelf and nothing ever happens to them. Will the same thing happen with the presidential commission, the report that was released last week? What's going to happen? Yeah, that's going to be put on a shelf. Okay. Oh, something's going to happen. Well, let's talk about how that gets implemented. It's because this panel is about the future. And there are things we will try to cover today on this panel that did not get covered during the afternoon, which is going to be a difficult thing to do, and I'm sure we'll cover a lot of those things again. But also, I have a whole bunch of questions that got asked that no one got to ask. So if you have other questions that you wanted to have asked during the afternoon and did not get to them, we'll try to cover as many of these questions as you can, because I'm used to doing a talk show where we ask the audience for questions, and we'll try to do that today. But we have a really interesting panel. We have a great mixture of folks in different kinds of lines of work. You probably can read who the panelists are from your program, but let me go over that a little bit here. And it's interesting that we're sitting in Washington, D.C., because, as you know, back in George Washington's time, D.C. was a swamp. And you're all sitting on landfill, more or less. Did they have the Army Corps? The Army Corps is pretty old, but I don't think it's not quite that old. But people still think Washington is a swamp, but for a different reason than the landfill that's here. We're not going to go into that today. But I bring it up because I was going to talk about, because one of our panelists is an expert on this, is the 800-pound gorilla that's in the room here that was only touched upon about a little bit, and that is global warming and the rise of the oceans and global warming. Because Washington is going to be one of those coastal towns, along with New Orleans and all the other towns in New York and all the other towns around the world, that in the next 100 years, and we'll talk about what those projections might be, we're talking about 3 to 6 feet rise in the ocean levels. And I have the Army Corps of Engineers sitting here next to me, and General Walsh, whose name was brought up a little bit before, might be able to tell us a little bit of what do we do about all those lands, those coastal regions that are going to be going underwater if global warming moves at a linear rate, and who knows, if it goes at a geometrical rate, how any of that stuff is going to happen. So I think that's one of the things we'll talk about today. And one of the items that I hear all the time when we talk about global warming and coastal regions is people talk about how expensive it is. We talked about today how much money there is in shoreline restoration, but no one really talks about what the cost of global warming is. or ocean rise? What does it cost to move the population inland from all the cities around the country, or just everybody along the coastline of the United States? What is the cost of either putting dikes or levees or whatever up to mitigate the rising water levels, or to move the people off the coast in their houses and their industries, their factories, or whatever? What does that cost compared to not doing anything about ocean sea level rise? So there are a lot of different topics to talk about today. As I say, I'll get into the questions, as many as I can, but let me introduce my panelists. As I say, this is Major General Michael J. Walsh, and he's commander of the Mississippi Valley Division and the commander of Task Force Hope, which we'll talk about a little bit before. But the boundaries of his jurisdiction are tremendous. His jurisdiction goes all the way up to Canada and down to the Mississippi, right, to the Gulf. And if you have questions about the Gulf, he's here to answer questions about the Army Corps of Engineers and their role in it. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about maybe what the charge of the Army Corps should be in the future. Don Boesch, next to the general, is professor of marine science and president of the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. He is a native of New Orleans. A couple of our panelists are native of New Orleans. Cokie Roberts tried to get me to speak that word correctly for 20 years. How do you say New Orleans? And Dr. Boesch has conducted research on coastal ecosystems around the world. And he also specializes in talking about global warming and ocean sea level rise, and maybe he'll be able to fill us in a little bit on what's happening there. He has an interesting talk that I'll mention later. Dr. William Walker is Executive Director of the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources. Dr. Walker completed a 28-year career at the University of Southern Mississippi, USM, in the Gulf Coast Research Laboratory, where he served as Associate Director. Dr. Walker, I think, entered into the public eye when in early August he issued an order to coastal municipalities to stop all BP-funded oil spill work in the Gulf because of diminishing threat from the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Made a lot of people angry, but that was how he saw it, and he called it. And we'll talk a little bit about that if you'd like. Cindy Brown is director of the Gulf of Mexico program of the Nature Conservancy. And you've heard about the Nature Conservancy, and their goal in the Gulf is to accelerate the pace and scale of restoration of key Gulf ecosystems. And one of Cindy Brown's projects, which really is interesting to me, and we'll talk about this, is to help restore the oyster reefs, vital oyster reefs of not just the Gulf, but actually the entire U.S. coastline. And she says that 85% of the oyster reefs have been destroyed. And if you like oysters, and you can go to their website and actually watch how they, starting up on the East Coast and moving all the way down to the south, how all the oyster reefs have gradually been destroyed. And the Conservancy has created a three-pronged restoration plan with a document that they call Gulf 2020. So let me begin with Cindy and see if there's any opening statements or anything you'd like to talk about first.
Sure.
Pick up your microphone. And if you have your questions, write them down, and I'll take all of them, and we'll get to as many of them as we can.
Thanks a lot, Ira. I guess if you could throw up slide number 36. Is anybody back there? Anybody home? They're already at the bar. Don't blame them. Okay.
You want to come back to you later? We'll go with the other panelists.
Yeah. Well.
Until they get the slides ready. Let me do that.
Okay,
you got
that's
it?
good. Yeah, because I actually
Okay.
need those slides. There we go. Okay, very good. Thank you. I'd like for everybody just to look at this slide for just a few seconds and let it sear on your brain. We all have the image of the well spewing oil into the Gulf for days and weeks and months, seared in our brain. And I heard reference made to the Gulf in the opening presentation, actually this morning before a lot of you got here. There was a film that detailed the growth of the oil and gas industry in the Gulf of Mexico. And in fact, at one point in our history, I guess we regarded the Gulf of Mexico as the Dead Sea, because we had sacrificed it theoretically for so much development. I'm here to tell you that the Gulf is not a dead sea. It is very much alive and thriving, as these pictures demonstrate. They're not doctored. They're actual places and species from the Gulf of Mexico. So even though we see the Gulf as a major producer of oil and gas and commerce and so forth, it's also an extremely important part of the world from a biodiversity standpoint. Over 15,000 species of plants and animals have been documented here. The Heart Institute actually recently made that report. The Conservancy has been part of this system, the Gulf of Mexico, for 35 years. We've got dozens of projects across the Gulf, many staff, many offices in every state that touches the Gulf. And so it's our belief and our knowledge that, in fact, restoration of the Gulf of Mexico is very doable. It's our vision that in doing so, we're going to create jobs and stimulate local economies in the short term, and in the long term, of course, provide all of those ecosystem services and functions that we've been talking about all day. What I guess I'd like to emphasize, because we've talked a lot about plans, is that in fact there are plans and programs and projects that are ready to go right now. We've got many proof of concept projects across the Gulf of Mexico, small scale projects that are ready to be scaled up. What we need, of course, are the financial resources to do that. What I want to share with you today, though, is a story of hope, and it has to do with oysters. So if I can just quickly go through my story of restoring an oyster reef, I'd appreciate it. There's a place along the Gulf Coast where, you know, those of us who are from the Gulf and who have survived Katrina and the oil spill and all of the disasters that have hit are pretty beaten down, to be honest. But we're not giving up. There's a place along the Gulf Coast in Alabama, Mobile Bay, where folks are really sort of gathering their wits about them, collecting their resources, and are ready to make a difference regardless of what Congress does, although Congress designating Clean Water Act penalties would certainly help. The coast of Alabama was hard hit by the oil spill, but before that, the oyster resource was greatly decimated, as it has been across the Gulf Coast. And oysters are important. They provide food, as you mentioned, Ara, but they also cleanse water, they protect shorelines, they provide habitat for other fish. And the Conservancy made an investment through the help of NOAA, American Recovery and Reinvestment Act funds, just a couple of years ago to scale up what have been very small-scale demonstration projects. We've begun to build over a mile of oyster reef in Mobile Bay. We were almost finished with that project when the oil spill hit, and we spent the next several months just simply trying to protect it. If you can see the next slide, what I'd like to report is that the reef was spared any major oiling, and in fact we're now seeing spat, that's the slide I'd like for you to see, spat actually beginning to, our baby oyster larvae beginning to set on the substrate that we installed. It's a story of hope, and I think what it tells us is that even in the face of what has been the largest oil spill offshore in America's history, restoration is possible. The oil spill and what's happened as a result of the Deepwater Horizon and what's happened there in Mobile Bay is also giving us hope. Several partners have come together, including the Nature Conservancy, Mobile Bay Keepers, Alabama Coastal Foundation, and the Ocean Foundation, more determined than ever after this oil spill to do something about their coastal environment. They basically schemed up a plan to greatly expand that 1 mile project to something of a much larger scale. They essentially dreamed up a vision to restore Alabama's coast, to create jobs through restoration, to restore the fisheries, to make those communities more sustainable in the face of storms and other events like this oil spill. They're calling their vision 100-1000. I think it's been referred to maybe earlier today. Essentially, the idea is to build 100 miles of oyster reef and to restore 1,000 acres of seagrasses and marshes. Next slide. I don't know if any of you have any free time this weekend, but the next installation, or I should say